Today's inflation read blowing up the notion that inflation has peaked. The question now is, when will it? And as long as it remains hot, where can you find opportunities? With us now is Pomp Investments founder Anthony Pompliano, better known to many of you as Pomp. Welcome to our new program. It's good to see you on this venue.
Good to see you, Scott. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. You know, your tweets today caught my attention first and foremost, and obviously I want to discuss crypto and Bitcoin with you during this interview, but let's start with these tweets you had. Undisciplined monetary and fiscal policy doesn't work was one of them. You can't print trillions of dollars and manipulate markets without consequences. Were you surprised by the CPI print as much as others?
Listen, Scott, if you go back to January 1st, 2020, and you look at asset prices since then, Bitcoin is up 400% since that point. The S&P is up about 22%, NASDAQ's up 36%, gold's up about 10%. The dollar is basically fallen off a cliff. Median home prices are up 30%. And I think what we're watching is that undisciplined monetary and fiscal policy. It's turned the stock market and other assets into a casino. It's created incredible short-term thinking among investors. But over the long run, there is one thing that continues to act exactly as it's designed, which is Bitcoin. And the people who have continued to dollar cost average into that asset, 65.5% of all Bitcoin hasn't moved in a year, regardless of the volatility. And it continues to serve as the one thing that no one can manipulate and no one can change, that programmatic monetary policy. And in light of the undisciplined monetary and fiscal policy, it tends to be the sanity in an insane world.
So there's a lot in there of what obviously you just said, and you've maintained for a long time, certainly as long as I can remember, that Bitcoin is an inflation hedge. You tweeted, I'm looking at one from August of 2021, where you cite the return over the last 12 months of gold versus Bitcoin, and you say, quote, Bitcoin is the true inflation hedge. If that is the case, why has Bitcoin been cut in half, and why doesn't it go up if the inflation read was so hot?
Yeah, I think there's two things that are important to understand. First, assets that are inflation hedges, they move before the inflation comes. So if you remember in 2020, Paul Tudor Jones, Stanley Druckenmiller, many other sophisticated investors came out and said, listen, I think inflation is coming and I am going to move my assets now in anticipation. And that's where you saw Bitcoin go from about $10,000 all the way up to $64,000 in March of 2021. We started to get the over 5% inflation prints in June, July of the summer of 2021. And so inflation hedge assets move before. Now, that's why if you go back from before the pandemic to today, Bitcoin being up 400%. I always say to people, if you could go back and rewind time with the benefit of hindsight, you wouldn't buy stocks, you wouldn't buy bonds, you wouldn't buy real estate. You would have bought Bitcoin. It has been the best performer and it has served as that inflation hedge. Now, the second thing to understand also is that right now we're in this slow bleed of some sort of liquidity crisis. If you go back to 2008, 2009, there was a liquidity crisis over the summer of 2008, and gold went down 30%. The government stepped in with tons of stimulus, and gold over the next 2 years rallied and hit an all-time high. My thesis in 2020 was exactly that. On March 12th, I wrote and I said, we're in a liquidity crisis and the government's going to have to step in. When they step in, people will run towards these safe haven assets that have sound money principles. Bitcoin is digital sound money. And so right now in 2022, what we're watching is that Bitcoin is going down and correlations are going towards one across all assets. So Bitcoin's going down, but so are stocks, bonds, real estate, et cetera. And the Fed's in control and they're crashing asset prices. But what ends up occurring is that once we get out of these higher correlation periods, Bitcoin will continue to outperform over a long period of time. And the reason is you have a finite asset that simply has a programmatic monetary policy. Humans are horrible at predicting the future. And so if you go and you look at the macroeconomic issues that we face, right now, wealth inequality has never been worse in America. And the reason is because 45% of Americans have no investable assets. They are getting punished by this high inflation. Food prices at home is 12%.